I just now want to introduce our host for the evening, Ofelia Montelongo, who is connected to the Writers Center in so many ways. She is an author. She is a past fellow of the Writers Center. She has taught at the Writers Center. She has taken workshops at the Writers Center. She's a committee member of one of our committees at the Writers Center. And here she is hosting one of our events. So we're so happy that you're here, Ofe, and I want to hand off to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. I'm so excited. I'm seeing so many familiar faces. Hi, Vanessa. I can see you clapping. Thank you. And I'm so excited to be here for so many reasons. And one of the main reasons is that I get to talk with Jenn De Leon for an hour, well, for 55 minutes, 45 week counting the questions that you're probably gonna have. But I'm just so grateful with the Writers Center and for the space, but also just to have this opportunity to have these conversations, because I have like 10 pages of questions that I probably am not gonna get to it. But I'm just gonna tell you really quick how this happened. I started reading like Jennifer De Leon's book. The first one is Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, a YA book. I started reading, and then I saw her in an event from the library from Prince George County Library. I think it was back in December. And I saw her with Lupita and Nick, and I was like, I have so many questions. I had to interview her, and then I reached the SAC, and then everything is history. So we've been waiting for this interview or for this event since December, right, Jen? Since December, we've been waiting for these 45 minutes now that we have left for it. So I'm really excited. And I'm really nervous because I want to ask as many questions as I can, and I want you to ask as many questions as you can. So, Jen, I don't know if you can start us off. Well, I'm going to read a quick bio from Jen. I hope everyone knows about her from when you sign up. There was a super long bio. So, again, she wrote these two beautiful books that we're going to be talking about today. She's the editor also of Wise Latinas, Writers on Higher Education. De Leon has published prose in over a dozen literary journals, including Ploughshares, Iowa Review, and Michigan Quarterly Review, and is a Grove Street instructor and board member. She is assistant professor of creative writing at Framingham, I hope I say that right, State University, and faculty membership in the MFA in Creative Nonfiction program at Bay Path University. She makes her home in the Boston area. So, and again, I pronounce things differently because I'm from Mexico, just in case you're wondering, where is her accent from? Who is this lady, right? And okay, so now, Jen, why don't you start us with a quick synopsis of both of the books and maybe a short reading?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a thrill. I love the vibe of the Writers Center. You know, I am not physically there, but I do feel like I'm at the Writers Center right now in some way. And I think that's a testament to your smiling faces, your energy, your vibe. So thank you for welcoming me into this space. And it's really great to see a couple of familiar faces. Vonetta, I have to give a shout out. I'm just so thrilled to see you. Oh my goodness. We met in a workshop years ago with Reina Grande at VONA, Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation in Philadelphia. It's just wild. I love this. So I'll tell you a little bit about my books. So Don't Ask Me Where I'm From is my young adult novel that debuted right smack in the middle of the pandemic. Perfect time to launch a book. And so Don't Ask Me Where I'm From tells the story of 15-year-old Liliana Cruz. And she is trying to fit in at her new high school. She lives in Boston, but she's part of a program called METCO, and it's a desegregation program. So she takes a bus every day for an hour from her apartment in the city to a predominantly white, affluent town. And she's really struggling to fit in. She changes her name to Lily. She changes how she dresses. She starts saying literally a lot and awesome. And meanwhile, her father is missing, or so she thinks he's missing. He's actually been deported to Guatemala. And up until this moment, she had no idea that her parents were undocumented. So it really sets her off on this coming of age path, this journey, this quest to find out more about where she's from, but don't ask her if you see her. And White Space is a collection of essays that just came out at the end of March. And this is, I know every book is special, but this book I've been working on for almost 10 years. And not every day, not every week, right? But here and there, and I can talk more about that today. But White Space consists of essays where I am exploring much of the white spaces that I've been a part of in my life. White spaces at school, at work, in graduate school, teaching, and the writer's workshop. And it's also about the white space of the page and how I've been working to really take up space and fill up that space on the page. So the essays deal a lot with identity, immigration, language, but also my path to becoming a published author. And when I was 28 years old, I quit my job and moved to Guatemala, which is where both of my parents are from. And I really wanted to have a connection with this country and to live there on my own. So many of the essays are about that trip as well. And thank you, Ofe, so much for inviting me and for hosting me here today, and for giving a shout out to Wise Latinas, because this book is an anthology that I edited in 2014. It was published, and these are essays written by different Latina writers reflecting on their experiences in college. So Sandra Cisneros writes in here that, you know, when she went to, her father said, Sandra, you went to college for 4 years and then 2 more years in graduate school and still no husband. And she's like, what, you know, and this is Sandra Cisneros, you can't imagine, like, you know, so the essays are by different Latina writers, and it's a great collection, definitely something that I wish I had had growing up. I was the first in my family to go to college, so a lot of the essays are relevant for any first-gen student that you might know. And I'll read a little bit from White Space, just a couple paragraphs to give you a sense of my writing. So in one of the essays titled Work, I reflect on just how difficult it has been and continues to be in some ways to claim the role of being a writer. Like, what does it actually look like? And how do you make a living off of this? And years ago, right after I had come back from Guatemala, a friend put me in touch with this famous author who needed a house sitter. And I jumped at the chance because I really wanted a few days away. At this point, I was living with my parents. I had just come back from Guatemala. I was sleeping on their pull-out couch. So not fun times, right? And when I went to house sit, my father said, what is house sitting? And I said, it's like babysitting, but for a house. And he's like, but how can a house walk away? Why does a house need a sitter? And he just was very confused. And the more I explained it to him, the more I realized it does sound kind of absurd. But he said, you know, only in America would somebody pay you to live in their house. And so when I was house sitting, I reflected on work and all the jobs that I've had and the jobs that my parents have had. And, you know, I really kind of wondered, will I ever really make it? Will I ever be able to call myself an author? So this is a part of that essay, and I'm reflecting on the years of work. After California, after I moved back to Massachusetts to teach for the Boston Public Schools, I turned 26. I rented a studio apartment in Back Bay because a part of me felt like I should, like it was something Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City would do, and she was a writer, so. The Boston Center for Adult Education was around the corner from my apartment. It offered classes in everything from an introduction to fencing, to watercolors, to fundamentals of investing, and to, yes, creative writing. One afternoon, I decided to sign up for memoir writing, smiling after I hung up the phone with the lady who took my credit card number. We met on Tuesday nights. The classes were held in the historic Gamble Mansion on Commonwealth Avenue. It was built in 1904 and was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Walter Baileys and their 6 children until 1936. On the first night, I made my way up the creaking spiral staircase to the classroom, which was really a small annex on the top floor. The angled ceiling and rectangular wooden table with centuries worth of nicks on its maple surface made me feel as if I was doing something important. 4 other women, all white, sat around the table. None of us looked up. The instructor introduced herself and then asked us to go around the room and do the same. Our first prompt, write about a trip you have taken that had significant emotional impact. I returned the following week with 6 stapled photocopies of my paper. I stared out the gray city heat through the smudged window, the sound of the air conditioner rattling in the background, while 4 strangers discussed my work. They said, "Your mom is funny," and "I went to Costa Rica once." They pronounced Guatemala, Guatemala. Their written comments were helpful, their edits thoughtful and precise. With multicolored pens, I wrote down the titles and authors of every book they mentioned. Oh, that reminds me of Lori Moore. I love Grace Paley. Have you ever read Eat, Pray, Love? Yes, I loved it. You would like Jeanette Walls. The other students mentioned authors like they were old friends from camp. I didn't dare admit I hadn't heard of a single one. I said, I like the book Drown by Junot Diaz. A woman said, I've heard of him. I added, and Frank McCourt. Oh yeah, he's good, they said. I attended every one of the 6 classes on Tuesday nights in July and August that summer as if my life depended on it, as if all the lives of the people in my stories did. When the class was over, we exchanged email addresses and promised to keep in touch, which we never did. I'll stop there.
Bravo, bravo, just clapping. And that was actually one of the scenes that I connected a lot, being from Mexico and being in wide spaces and creative writing spaces where people don't 100% understand you, or you just nodding when they're saying other things, right? And I'll ask you a question about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to ask you about the process of the process of both of the books, because when I was reading them, I read this one first, and then I reread it for the event, and then I was reading at the same time, and they're so connected in so many ways. And sometimes I felt like my nonfiction and fiction, like I saw you like Liliana, like you're Liliana, right? Even though you aren't, but so everything was weaved and connected in my mind. And I just wanted to ask you, is how was the process of writing both of these books, and was one harder than the other one, or more difficult? Or in one time were you like confusing it, like, am I Liliana? Am I Jen? Who am I? Or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, totally different processes. And I'll tell you, with Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, I had a totally different draft before. It was told in third person point of view and set in the 90s. And I attended a conference and I met with an editor who said, have you considered setting it in, making it contemporary and maybe first person? And I thought no and no. And because she said, if you set it in the 90s, it's historical fiction. And that just blew my mind because I'm like, how can the 90s be historical fiction? But okay. And I thought, first person, I can't write it in first person. I don't know what a teenager sounds like. But then I realized at that point, I had been teaching in Boston Public Schools for 10 years. I had 100 students on my roster every year, 7th and 8th grade. I definitely knew what a teenager sounded like. And so I went to the page and I revised the whole book, and it really kind of came out really fast. I mean, in a couple months. Granted, I had had a whole draft before in third person. But it was a messy first draft, but it existed. And then I revised it for another year. I had a fellowship, so that helped. And we sold the manuscript in January 2018. And it didn't come out until this past August. So 2 years and 5 months, not that I'm counting or anything. And then with White Space, I wrote an essay called The White Space. For the book, I decided to take off the. And I entered it to contest. It won the 4th genre Michael Steinberg essay contest, I want to say in 2012. And so for this one, I didn't set out to write an essay collection. I was writing and publishing essays here and there. And I got these out to show you. So these are some of the literary magazines and journals where I placed essays, many of which are in this book. But I was just like, oh, I published this essay in the Southeast Review. Oh, Prairie Schooner published Jim's. Oh, Michigan Quarterly Review published work, and the Iowa Review. So on and so forth. But I wasn't thinking about writing a book, but the number of essays started to collect. And then I thought, maybe I have an essay collection. And so that's why it kind of took so long, because I wasn't like, I'm writing an essay collection. So that's a long answer, but yeah, totally different processes. And don't ask me where I'm from. I had an agent, and the book went to auction. We had several editors interested in it. And I worked with Simon and Schuster. With Whitespace, it was very different in the sense that the book won the Juniper Prize with the University of Massachusetts Press, and they have a very small staff, incredibly hardworking. I think there are like 3 or 4 people there. So just a different kind of machine, I guess.
Sounds great. And can you talk a little bit more also about, because in your new collection of essays, I mean, the title is Wise Space. So can you talk about, like, there's 2 meanings in the book, right? About the resume, your dad's resume, and the white space that we occupy, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that, about the double meaning of it?
Yes, definitely. So years ago, it was Thanksgiving, and that night I was at my parents' house and I was starting to leave, had my coat, everything. And then my father says, oh, I need to apply for this temp agency. I need a resume. And I really didn't think I had heard him correctly, because my father's had one job like his whole life. He spray painted computer parts in a factory. And then he had cancer. And after cancer, after surviving cancer, thank goodness, he was just kind of doing odd jobs here and there, but he needed a resume for the first time in his life. And at that time he was 57. So we sat down, I had my laptop, and the process of writing his resume was really intense, because he didn't finish school in Guatemala, and he really had only had one job his whole life in Boston. And what recommendations could I put? What internships, what work experience, what do I list under education? This school in Guatemala nobody's ever heard of, so the process of writing that was an occasion for me to ask him more questions about what was in the white space and what wasn't listed on this very important document, right? Our resume. It's pretty high stakes when you apply for a job. Your resume is your handshake to the employer. And for him, I knew that it wasn't doing justice to all that he had lived and experienced. So that became the structure for the essay. And that essay is actually told through footnotes of his actual resume. And it was really fun to write it that way. I didn't know you could write an essay in that way. I didn't know to call it a lyric essay, but I took classes and I read a lot and I learned, oh, you can do this. Oh, you can do that. Okay. And I just kind of took a leap of faith there. But yeah, and then the white space is also, I guess, referring to the white space of my own resume, which is much longer than his, but it still has white space. There's still so much to explore. And I think that's part of what motivated me to move to Guatemala.
That's awesome. And that's one, well, I saw myself a lot in both of the books, but a specific scene about white space and about Liliana. Again, I'm myself mixing fiction and nonfiction, and seeing you in creative writing workshops. And I'll tell a little bit about my experience just to ask this question, because I'm from Mexico. I came here like 13 years ago, and there's not really like Spanish classes, like Spanish speaking classes for creative writing. So I started writing in English, and I got all those questions as well. Like all those kind of like micro aggressions. I was like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And just like Liliana in one of the scenes that the teacher, there's like, I hope this is fiction, like, I don't believe you, right? And how we navigate through the white spaces. And there's really there's really not a set of rules of how to do it. And I was really naive because I didn't know I was doing it until later on that I reflected upon that, right? And I was just wondering, do you have like, right now, everything is evolved, like we're more aware of things, you know? And do you have any advice for how to navigate the spaces, how to navigate the white spaces in monolingual spaces like that?
Yes, I mean, I like you said, there are more resources now, or I guess just more awareness, more transparency, and people can share their experiences online and social media, all of that. But when I was taking these workshops, I was very much, I always was the only person of color in the workshop, you know, and what happens then is, like in my experience, I started to feel like my stories that they didn't matter, or they were weird, or I couldn't use Spanish, or if I wrote about, um, you know, a mother who acted a certain way, that everybody would think immediately that's your mother, because they didn't have context. They didn't have other examples of Latinx characters. And the reading lists were almost always dead white male authors. And don't get me wrong, I love me some James Salter. Richard Yates is one of my favorite writers, but so isn't Junot Diaz, and so isn't Chimamanda Adichie. You know, so there's a lot of work that that needs to be done on decolonizing syllabi, frankly. But aside from that, feeling like the only one over and over and over again, you really start to believe that there's no place for you on the bookshelf. And so what I did, and what I think writers need to do if they feel that way or are experiencing that, is find communities where you're not the only one. And there are more groups like that now. So I joined VONA, Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation. At the time, it was the only writers of color workshop in all genres. And I went every summer. I just used all my extra money and just bought plane tickets and stayed with friends. And that's how I did it. I was just hustling my way through this journey. And then I joined Macondo, which is a writing workshop that Sandra Cisneros founded in San Antonio. I went to Bread Loaf on scholarship. You know, I just kind of found my way. I joined Grub Street in Boston. And so you find these spaces, but I also read a lot. Reading a lot of writers of color helped me kind of, it counter that voice in my head that said, you're the only one, you're the only one. You know, so by reading these stories and narratives, it kind of muted that voice and made louder the voice of like, no, you come from a long, deep, wide tradition of storytelling, and publishing isn't an accurate manifestation of all the stories that we have inside of us and that our ancestors have. It's one piece of it. I didn't grow up with books. You know, it's like ironic that I'm an author, because it's true, but I always say this, but it's true. We only had the Bible and the Yellow Pages in my house for books. And yet, I felt rich in stories because my parents were constantly sharing in that way. My cousins, my grandmother, my aunt, my uncle, that's just the way we grew up. So I think it's important to make that distinction between written, published text and storytelling.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And actually, I felt that so much because, and I'm so proud I'm gonna share it. Like I got accepted into Macondo for this summer, so I'm so excited.
Oh my goodness, congratulations.
The third year, for the third year. So I finally, with Daisy Hernandez, I'm gonna be working with Daisy.
Oh my goodness, yeah, she's wonderful. Yeah, she has an essay in here, and we're doing an event later with Tin House, and her book is coming out, The Kissing Bug.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I'm sorry, I didn't want to like, but now that you mentioned it, like I remember, like I'm so excited, like for the third time I'm applying, and
up, because that's a really good point, that you apply for the third time. And that's the other thing I think we can do, is demystify the process of applying for residencies and fellowships and workshops. You know, there's so many things that I applied for that I didn't get the first time, and that you apply again and again.
Yeah,
And
yes, yeah. Or sometimes you're not ready. Your writing is not ready. That's what I have felt. Like sometimes I think like, oh, I'm writing super good. And then actually I'm not. Like, then I can see my progress as a writer as I move on. That's why resources also like the writers that are super important. And, you know, VONA as well. I got an opportunity to go and work with Reina Grande. And I think I cried at the end. I hope she didn't think less of me. But it was such a great experience to be in community with people didn't ask me about my accent or why do I have an accent like this or something like that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And we have a few questions, and I'm slacking on the questions over here, I think. And I'm gonna mix one of my next questions with Vanessa's question, and that is about how do you make the how do you decide what goes and what doesn't go in your essay collection? And I'm gonna combine it with Vanessa's question, that is, did you have to revise any of the essays to fit the theme of the book, or did they all happen to fit already?
really great questions. And I could teach a class, I think, on the process of putting together an essay collection, only because I didn't know what I was doing at all, you know, and then it was like, I learned as I was going, and now I want to share that information. So basically, as I mentioned, I wrote essays that I thought they were, you know, reasons why you write essays. They're questions you're kind of turning over, knots of memories you're trying to detangle, lots of reasons why you write essays. But I wasn't thinking about a collection, so I was publishing them here and there, not worried about how they would connect. But once I decided I wanted to complete a manuscript, I did have to make those decisions of like, okay, well, I mean, it's sort of like packing. If you know you're going to a sunny location, to Miami, you realize, okay, I need to pack shorts, skirts, sandals. Probably doesn't make sense to bring my winter coat, you know, and so it really felt that way, like on a practical level, like what fits, what doesn't. And I needed to have a through line. You know, how was I the narrator different in the first essay from the last essay? So I needed a narrative arc in that way, and to tell a story of change, of internal change. And that's when I decided that the structure of the book should be centered around my trip to Guatemala. And so those essays were, it's basically before Guatemala, during Guatemala, and then when I came home. Do they fit neatly? No, not all of them. And I found that that actually helped in the sense that there were cross references, kind of like a painting where there's some red here and then you see a little bit of red over there. And I don't know if I'm making sense, but it sort of felt like it felt like it was gelling and connecting. And I didn't do heavy edits on the essays themselves because they had already been published, and I know I could have changed them, but they felt complete and whole. I definitely used a copy editor and we went through and everything, but the essays that hadn't been published, I used those as an opportunity to augment the themes that I was seeing surface throughout the book, if that makes sense. And I did write an author's note, so I think maybe that helped. And there were so many, there's so many essays that are not in here, which is what's funny. And I want to write another collection or a memoir, or all these different stories. I mean, there's so much in here about motherhood, about struggling to have our second son, about being a Latina professor. You know, now we're in a predominantly white town, so I'm seeing my children grow up, and so there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I think I'll be writing essays until I'm on my deathbed.
And we're so grateful for that. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. And people in the chat are suggesting that please teach a class about putting together essay collections. And I actually took a class with Jenn, and she what was it, probably a month ago, and I wrote a whole essay in that too, in 2 hours. So she's amazing. So follow her on Twitter and Instagram, and because you're doing workshops right now, you're doing a few workshops that I've seen here and there. So she's teaching workshops. So for sure, and she will. I think she's typing her info over there, and for sure, and she's amazing on that. And I wanted to ask you another long question, and I hope I can phrase it correctly. Like in your in both of the books, in the collection of essays and the YA book, you talk a little bit about history of Guatemala, history of La Guerrilla, and you do such a great job that I was like, how amazing. How amazing is this that you can combine a little bit of both without sounding like really like a lecture or like preaching or anything, but it's just like really natural, super organic, introducing. Here is why a lot of people migrate to the United States. And because me as a writer, like I'm really self-conscious when, and I ask myself a lot of questions when I do that, when I'm writing about race, about class, culture, because it's like, I ask myself like, who am I trying, who do I want to read this? Who is gonna be my reader? When we write about these, who are we writing for? So I ask myself a lot of questions, and I see you do such a great job with mixing like the history, and you do such a great blend. And I just wanted to hear advice and recommendations about it.
Thank you so much. You're really lifting me up. It's really so great because, you know, you write alone and you're like, it takes so long. So many people thought I wrote this book during the pandemic. They're like, wow. I'm like, no way did I write this during the pandemic. I could barely check my email during the pandemic. But anyway, I also have to pause and say hello to Elizabeth Wall. I cannot even, I mean, this is crazy. Elizabeth and I went to college together and we studied abroad in Vietnam together. Right? I think I do have my journal from Vietnam. Do you remember? I would like see, she's witness. Oh my gosh. So yeah, I want to write about that, living in Vietnam, and like we had bicycles and we lived there. Elizabeth is incredible. Okay, so infusing history into narrative. I think I try to do it in a way that I would want to read it, you know, and I am not a journalist. I'm not someone who writes academic papers regularly, you know, and so it's a different kind of writing, and it needs to be organic if you infuse this into the narrative in an essay. Otherwise, it feels very shoved in and extraneous. And so I tried to put it in places where I, as the narrator, was questioning the history, or when I was learning in real time, you know, in scene. And for me, that made sense. The thing that you said about audience is so important. I mean, I really feel strongly that we need to write our stories and document them and really have these testimonies in print, because then they will last beyond our lifetime. And I wish I had had more literature, more access to the limited stories that there were, you know, about Guatemala when I was growing up. And so I think, oh, maybe this essay collection can be read by young Latinas, or maybe a person whose family is from Guatemala, but they were born here, you know, all sorts of identities. And I think there is a power in it being in text, you know, it exists, we can hold it in our hands.
And I think it's like really powerful in both of the books, but also like how Liliana in the YA book, she's discovering all of these about her own heritage, and she's just reading more in Enrique's journey. Like she's reading more, and she's educating herself too, because in that school, in other schools, they don't have a history of Central America. They don't have that. And it's also super important. And for me, that happened to me too. Like I learned more about Mexico here in the US, and also about Central America, thanks to a class I took in grad school. And it's amazing that it can be so everyone can learn from early on. So kudos to that. I was so happy to see it. I have but we're gonna switch gears about how in your collection of essays, you write, of course, it's a personal essays. You write a lot about you, about your person. How do you feel writing about your family? Because this is because I write essays too, but I'm super self-conscious of writing about my family without them getting mad. So I don't know if anyone relates to that. And I don't know if you have any recommendations about that, like if you freely write about them, or do you like double think about not sharing too much? Or how do you feel about that?
I have two things to say about that. One is this quote that you're making me think of that Stephen King said. He said in his amazing memoir on writing, he says, "You write with the door closed, but you publish with the door open." And I've always kind of gone back to that, because when I'm writing, it's really hard to think about what's my mother going to say about that? Or like, oh, my sister's going to be so mad, whatever it is, and if I'm feeling shame about sharing something, I've learned to realize that means it's a hot spot. And by that, I mean, there's energy there and I need to write into it. And this is all in the writing, in the generative stage. Later, when I revise, that's with the door open, meaning that's for anyone who wants to read it. Once something's published, you can't control that part. So you have to revise with that in mind. And if there's really something that you're not comfortable sharing, that's the time to either finesse it or take it out or whatnot, because again, once that door is open, that's it. The second thing I'll say is that I learned early on that it's that fear that actually means for me, it gives me energy, like, okay, then I really need to share this. And so early on, I was 19 years old when I published my first essay in Ms. Magazine. I had done an internship there, and so it was this whole thing. But the essay that I wrote was about going to get birth control, going to the gynecologist for the first time. And I was so embarrassed and ashamed. What would my mother think if she knew I was on birth control, right? That I had a boyfriend and everything. And oh my God. So I went to the gynecologist's office and I offered to pay cash because I didn't want her to use my insurance. And I had my wad of bills from babysitting, from how crazy. And when I told her, don't use my parents' address, use my college PO box. And she talked about microaggressions. She was like, "You're in college?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm in college." Right. And so then I go into the office and they're speaking in English, the nurses. And then they turn to me and they're like, "Hablas inglés?" And I'm like, what in the hell? I'm like, yeah, I speak English. And so then I asked for a female doctor. It's just culturally, it's a big deal for Latinas to go to the gynecologist. It's a big deal. And here I was by myself and felt such shame. And so then a male doctor comes in. It was this really traumatic experience. And after all that, they still billed the insurance and sent the letter to my mother. So she drove to my college campus. Elizabeth knows, she was there, and I was in my dorm, and she passed the envelope to me, and it was such an intense moment, and I started to cry. It was just like hot tears. I couldn't even say anything. I was so ashamed. And then she said, "You know what? I'm really proud of you." And I just like all the air left me, like, what? And she said, you're taking control of your life and you're making wise choices. And she said, I'm proud of you. So that's what I wrote about. And Ms. Magazine wanted to publish it, this international magazine, right? And I'm like, how about that? I don't know. And I called my mother and said, they want to publish it. This is a big deal. I don't know. What do you think? The family might read it. Dad might read it. This is really bad. And she said, no, have them publish it. So I just after that, I felt like I could kind of write about anything, and my mom would have my back. So who knows?
I just want to say I love your mom. Like throughout this story, I was like, I'm just in love with your mom. She's a warrior. Like even like until the end that you close up with mothers. Sorry, spoiler alert. But I just really, I'm not saying anything important, but I just really love her and how she supported you and yeah. So and yeah, and just sending love to all the moms because they are amazing. They're amazing. And I love that story as well because you had in some places I just laughed aloud, like in like in both of the books. I was like, oh my goodness, because I think you wrote in that essay, you wrote something like, well, my dad doesn't know, but I think if he's gonna read this, he's gonna find out, like, right? Like you're. So does he know now? That was my question. Did he read that essay?
I have 2 kids. Yeah, I feel like he knows. Yeah. No, but yeah, there is that. I mean, my mom, as you know from reading the books and everything, she's very much like a go-getter, a trailblazer, like do the thing, and so I feel fortunate in that way. She has always raised us to be that way. But there's still some things that are hard to write about, even about her, and that final essay in White Space, I kind of start to engage with that and her limitations with school and everything, and the guilt that I felt in not helping her as much as I thought I should have. Anyway, it's complicated, right? It's very complicated. But that essay is in here, The White Ceiling, that I published all those years ago in Ms. Magazine. So in that way, essay collections are cool, right? Like you get to kind of reincarnate previous stories, because who's going to look up an issue from 2000, right? The year 2000, like Ms. Magazine. So that part feels special, like these stories get to live on.
That's amazing. And your parents as well. I felt so connected and so seen as how they talk about writing, right, with you. And it was just amazing because I felt like my parents do, like, are you gonna eat with writing? How are you gonna survive, right? What kind of career are you gonna have? And I guess a lot of us, if we are writers, we can connect with that. So go and buy her collection of essays so we can all relate to that. Go everyone, go.
Yeah.
I have another question before we turn it to, well, I have, again, 10 pages of questions, but I'm not gonna be able to actually ask them all. But I wanted to ask you about code switching, because it's, and there's like 2 types of code switching that we can talk about. One is language, like Spanglish, going back and forth in, or not even going back and forth, like blend the languages and just speaking like that. And the other one is about culture, right? How we code switch, and in different ways, like Liliana, like we all do, right? Depending in what spaces we go to. So I wanted to ask you, and you can answer for whatever code switching you want and prefer. But for example, what strategies do you use to do code switching in any of the books? And if you wanna, language, it's the most interesting for me too. But
yeah,
you can whichever.
I will say that I used to try really hard to write like what I thought a writer sounded like. And that meant very stiff, like buttoned up, like proper. And I thought if I used like the bigger vocabulary word, the better. And it's just not the case. It really kind of weighs down the prose. It makes it abstract and inauthentic. And once I realized that the opposite was true, that by writing from your authentic voice and really using your personality and humor and vulnerability and truisms that maybe you say in a way that no one else says it, not because you're better, but because you're you. Once I put all of that on the page, I felt like things started to click. And you learn so much as you're writing. I realized I like short sentences, more declarative kind of sentences. I love images. I love metaphors. I love alliteration. I love dialogue. I tend to write essays a little bit more like fiction in some ways, with scenes and setting and characters. But in nonfiction, there's room for that introspection and that reflection and the meaning making. So that's why I like the essay form. But fiction, you then have the reader do more of that inferring and the meaning making. So it's just very different. But definitely don't try to write like anyone else. Like, write like yourself, and do a deep dive into that, kind of double down and realize that Frank McCourt said this, that what you're trying to do as a writer is you're trying to put two words together that have never been put together before. So his example was a scintillating turnip. He said, nobody's ever said that before. Nobody's ever written that before, but I just did, a scintillating turnip. And he said, as a writer, you're trying to put two words together that have never been put together before, over and over and over again. And I thought, wow, that is true. That's what it's like. And that helps you in revising, because if you realize, oh, someone said this before, then it's a cliche, or it's just too easy. You need to crack it open, make it new. So I find that empowering. I also find it really fun to manipulate language in a new way. I mean, we're all working with 26 letters in the alphabet. It's, if we're writing in English anyway. And as Spanish speakers, we get double dip. We have two ink jars. We got the English and the Spanish. And I do mix them. I would say that I used to code switch a lot more. And now I think I do more something called code meshing, where instead of going from one to the other, like if I'm at work and I'm like, yes, I will see you at that department meeting. No problem. Wonderful. Have a fabulous weekend, all like formal. And then I'll turn around and, my husband calls and I'm like, are you going to stop at Trader Joe's? Because if you can't stop at Trader Joe's, then I will, because we really need peanut butter crackers for Mateo. It's like you talk differently. You switch from one to another. Then my mother calls me like, oh, forget it. So anyway, code meshing is when you mix them at the same time. And I do this with my students all the time. We'll be talking about Marxist theory and, critical race theory, applying it to a text. And then I'll say, dang, you guys are so smart, something like that. And so it kind of is a way to mix in my two personalities. I don't know. Now I'm rambling, but I just saw that Patrick De Leon is on here. He's my cousin. Oh my goodness. Hi. This is like, I just love this Zoom so much.
We love it too. And I just want to say, and that it's so wonderful that that you had a Latina, a Guatemalan, a Central American writer that teaches creative writing, because I think in my writing life or journey, I have taken like hundreds of workshops, and perhaps I have taken 4 or 5 max workshops with Latina writers, and I'm like, no, I want more. So I want more of that, and it's just amazing. No, it's just amazing. So I would love to take more workshops with you, for sure. We have like 7 more minutes, and again, I have more questions, but I wanna go and read a couple of questions over here in the chat. So, and you can everyone can start also writing the questions. I'm not forgetting about them. There was a question from Carol. She was asking, can you talk more, or can you talk some more about how writing classes and what type of writing classes were most helpful to you?
Oh, I mean, the classes that have been most helpful, I mean, they're all helpful, right? In different ways. The ones that really helped me dig into my culture and my identity and the space that I'm writing from, definitely classes like at VONA, the workshops there. Juno Diaz, he always stressed that, writing the words, that's one piece of it, but you really have to work on yourself and work on taming that critical self. and the voice that's on your shoulder, you know, that's saying like, no one's going to want to read this. What's the point? You think that's good? That's not good. You know, all those kinds of voices. So he worked with us a lot on that. And so that was extremely helpful. But then there are also classes where we really get in there with the craft. And of course, that's 100% important. We're working with words, so we have to figure out how to mold them and manipulate them, and what are some strategies and just some tips and ones that, so I guess in that way, I mean, I love learning, I love education in general. I think that looking at models, really taking them apart. I love classes where we will take apart a story, like, you know, a mechanic takes apart an engine and then puts it back together again. Like, how is this made? How did the writer do this? So those classes are great. Workshop in general, I love deadlines. So anything where I can share and have a deadline is great. I know there are a lot of conversations happening now around the workshop model and kind of making it less or making it more anti-racist. And so I think there's work to be done too. But in general, honestly, I think any format that's getting you to generate work and look at your work critically can be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. There's another question. What is the difference between personal essays and memoirs?
Yeah. So from what I understand, you know, personal essays are standalone stories. They tend to be ones that, I mean, it ranges. It could be 500 words, 1,500 words, 5,000 words, but more or less in that ballpark. And the way that Cheryl Strayed describes a personal essay, Cheryl Strayed is the author of several books, but one is Wild, which is a memoir. But what she says about personal essays is that you're telling a story about a certain event or experience in your life, and you're offering some introspection and meaning making. But at the end, you should be able to read the last sentence and then say, and after that, nothing was ever the same again. And I love that because it's a real shift. It's a change. It doesn't mean happy ending, right? But it is something has changed. So I love that definition. And then memoir is a full-length book that is a reflection. It could be a series of stories, or it could be a memoir about, in Cheryl Strayed's case, when she hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, when she was grieving her mother's death. So there's usually a through line that is plot-based, right? It can't just be like, oh, I went to get ice cream, then I came home, then I got another ice cream, right? It has to have some plot points in the way that a novel does. But then what makes it different from a novel, aside from the fact that it's true, is that there's an emotional quest as well. There's a real yearning, and there are stakes attached to that. And again, it doesn't mean that at the end, things will be wrapped up with a bow, but you want to feel like, wow, this narrator is different at the end than they were on page one. And I love it all. I love it all. I wish there were 100 hours in a day. I would just write.
Well, we need to keep promoting that and keep promoting your work in also Central American literature, not only from South America or Mexico, but also from Central America. And I see my my professor of Central American literature, and I want to share before everyone leaves, because I see people leaving already. She's going to be hosting an event next week with Central American writers. So I just put it in the chat. And so because we need to support and hear more stories about Central American authors. So, and okay, so we have 1 minute left, and we're probably not going to be able to get all of the questions, but I have to ask you the last question, which is the Writer Center question. And he's like, what brings you joy?
Ooh. Oh my goodness, joy. I mean, you know, it's so specific, but my toddler, he's 2.5, he's in this like growth spurt with his vocabulary. And he just says like the funniest things. But aside from that, I really love his feet. And you know, it's like so random, but he just has these like little chubby, cute little feet. And I know they're not going to stay that way forever. And when he's 14, I'm going to be like, oh, get out of here, you know, but I just love his little 2-year-old feet. They bring me joy.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And your, just really quick about your next novel, and then we'll close it out, right?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yes, my next novel is a young adult novel, and it's scheduled to come out in summer 2022. Wow. And it's called Maya, and it tells the story of 16-year-old Maya who lives in Guatemala. She's an aspiring fashion designer, and she and her mother get caught up with the maras, the gangs, and they have to flee in the dead of night for the Mexico-US border, at which point they are separated. So it's pretty intense, but I will say that I really wanted to write a story of joy and happiness, at least in the Guatemala part, you know, because these are not people who are like, oh, I just can't wait to go to the United States. It's the last thing on their mind. And they're living their lives and living a good life, you know, and she's super into fashion and everything, but they get caught up in a tough situation. And only then do they decide to flee. So I guess I wanted to write a counter narrative to so much of the stories, the single story that we see in the media. And yeah, and maybe some more essays. We'll see.
Well, I can't wait to read everything you write, Jen, and to go to your workshops. And I just want to thank everyone in the Writer Center. And again, thank you so much, Jennifer. I was so happy, and I can keep talking and asking you questions forever and ever. But everyone needs to go, I guess, you know, to do stuff, other stuff. I wanna pass it to Zach to close it up, and thank you everyone for being here.